Like many tales from long ago, this story started with a photograph, a quiet find, a simple picture hidden in the yellowed pages of an old leather album, forgotten on a dusty shelf in a storage room at London's Victoria and Albert Museum. Nobody knew that this photo would turn out to be more shocking than anything they had ever discovered. Dr. Margaret Murray, who studied old family photographs from the 1800s, found it while organizing donated items from a private collection. The collection had belonged to Dr. William Acton, a Victorian doctor who loved collecting old keepsakes. At first, the photograph looked ordinary for its time. 5 serious-looking children in their best clothes, standing close together in a straight line. But when Margaret turned the page and looked at the faded picture, something made her pause. The handwritten caption below the image said, "Whitechapel, 1901. 5 children." That's exactly what the picture showed. 5 kids lined up, boys and girls between ages 3 and 10, posed stiffly against a brick wall. Their faces had that rigid look common in old photos from long camera exposures and Victorian formality. But one child was different. The smallest one, a girl about 3 years old, stood on the far left. Her expression seemed strange, so did the way she stood. While the others held their heads up straight and looked at the camera, her head tilted slightly to one side, eyes closed. Margaret looked more closely. Something was wrong with how the picture was arranged. The girl's arms hung too straight down. Her body looked unnaturally stiff, almost like someone was holding her up. And then there was the lighting. The children were lit by what looked like artificial lamps. Behind them, everything appeared dark and shadowy. Margaret knew about death photographs. During Victorian times, taking pictures of dead people wasn't just normal, it was a special way to remember them. In an era when 1 in 5 children never lived to see their 5th birthday, when scarlet fever, diphtheria, and measles stalked nurseries like silent predators, death was a constant companion. For countless families, especially the poor, a photograph was an unthinkable luxury except when death came calling. Then, suddenly, parents would scrape together their last coins for one final image, knowing it would be the only photograph they would ever have of their beloved child. Parents often hired photographers to take one final image of a child who had died, making them look like they were just sleeping or even still alive, usually with their living brothers and sisters nearby. The photographers had become masters of their grim craft, painting rosy color onto pale cheeks, adding lifelike tints to cold lips, and most hauntingly, painting open eyes onto closed eyelids to maintain the illusion that death was merely sleep. She had seen many of these photos, but this one bothered her. Not because the girl might be dead that was sadly common back then, but because of how carefully planned the image seemed. Carefully set up, taken in private. She sent the photograph to the museum's lab for high-quality scanning, just wanting to document and preserve it. What came back changed everything and shocked Margaret completely. The enhanced image showed tiny details that couldn't be seen before. The girl's dress was perfect but too big, like it was borrowed. Her shoes didn't match, and under her left wrist, barely visible, was the shadow of a thin metal stand, the kind usually used to hold up a dead person's head during the long time needed to take a photograph. But there was something else that made Margaret's blood run cold. Around the girl's closed eyelids, she could detect the faintest traces of paint, a common Victorian practice where photographers would paint open eyes onto the closed lids of the deceased to create the illusion of life. And then Margaret noticed the most unsettling detail of all. While the other children appeared slightly blurred from the natural fidgeting that comes with being alive, the smallest girl was perfectly, unnaturally sharp in focus, the telltale sign that she had remained completely still throughout the exposure because she was already dead. It was becoming clear this was a death photograph. The youngest child, probably Mary Whitman, based on what was written, had been dead when the photograph was taken. Still, that wasn't unusual by itself. What was strange was when and where it happened. Why, Margaret wondered, would a family arrange for such a sensitive photograph without the usual mourning decorations or funeral flowers? Most death portraits, even private ones, were done more discreetly. Given how popular memorial photos were, it seemed odd that there appeared to be some shame around Mary Whitman's death, as if the family was trying to hide something. To learn more, Margaret started with the names. Whitman, Whitechapel, 1901. A quick search of the 1901 UK census found a matching family. Thomas and Catherine Whitman, with 5 children, listed William, Elizabeth, Frederick, Charles, and Mary. Their address, 42 Dorset Street, Whitechapel. Then she discovered something that made her sit up straight. Mary Whitman was listed in a burial record from March 6, 1901. Her cause of death, scarlet fever. The photograph, according to the faded stamp on the back, had been taken on March 5th, just one day before. Margaret held her breath. The photograph hadn't been taken to remember Mary. It had been taken while she was freshly dead or dying. This thought was even more disturbing than any other death portrait she had ever seen. She contacted Dr. Francis Galton, a forensic historian at the University of London, to help check the timeline and examine the scanned image more carefully. Galton had analyzed Victorian photographs before, and he understood immediately. "This arrangement is very deliberate," he said, pointing to where the other children stood. "Notice how they're each turned slightly away from her. Their feet point outward. Their shoulders lean to the right. None of them are touching her." He pointed again, this time at their hands. "See how they're hidden, folded behind their backs or hanging stiffly at their sides. That's not just Victorian manners. That's discomfort." Then Galton's voice dropped to barely a whisper as he made the most chilling observation of all. "Look at the focus, Margaret. Really look. The living children, see how they're slightly blurred around the edges? But her." He paused, his finger hovering over the smallest figure. "She's perfectly sharp. Unnaturally so. The dead don't move, Margaret. They never move." In the image, it was now clear that Mary wasn't being held or hugged. She stood alone, slightly separated. The other children were alive. She was not. In many other death portraits Margaret had seen, the dead person was often held, embraced, or seated very close to the living family members. It was almost like the other Whitman children felt disgusted by their sister. Margaret could somewhat understand it was probably a very confusing time for the young Whitmans, but in Victorian times, children usually obeyed their parents without question. Why hadn't Thomas and Catherine made the children stand closer together? Margaret couldn't help feeling troubled. It was almost like the photo had been rushed. It lacked the sadness and emotion that she'd seen in other similar photographs. But the location continued to bother Margaret, too. She searched local records for any mention of photographers working in Whitechapel in 1901 and found a listing in a business directory. H. Baden and Associates, mortuary photography services, operating briefly between 1897 and 1901, then closed down. She had heard of Baden before. The name appeared in a single court record from 1902 about a licensing violation. No formal charges were filed, but the complaint was strange. An anonymous person had claimed that Baden created fake photographic evidence for private clients in matters of wills and inheritance. The accusation went nowhere. No details were recorded. But now, Margaret wondered, was this more than just a mourning photograph? Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. Back at the museum, she requested access to the original donation files from the Acton collection. Dr. William Acton, who had owned the album, had been a doctor. His old medical records were included in the donation, mostly filled with prescriptions and house call notes. But one entry, dated March 4th, 1901, stood out. Whitman family visit. Mary Whitman, 3 years old. High fever, rash, likely scarlet fever, death expected, family told. No death certificate until further orders. And below, written faintly, deal made with H. Baden. Private photo to be taken before official record. Margaret sat quietly. This wasn't just a death portrait. This was a deliberate delay, a family working with a doctor and a photographer to postpone the official record of a child's death long enough to take a photograph that would make it seem she was still alive. But why? She didn't have the answer yet. But she knew now that this image wasn't what it appeared to be. The theory that started forming wasn't about morbid curiosity, but about reasons. Why would a grieving family delay officially recording their daughter's death? Why photograph her after death so carefully, surrounded by her siblings, at night in a private yard? Margaret and Dr. Galton's team checked inheritance records from 1901 and found something unexpected. Just weeks after Mary Whitman's recorded death date, a small inheritance had been processed from the estate of Mr. Henry Whitman, Thomas Whitman's father. His will was simple: 150 to be split equally among Thomas's children, as long as they were alive when it was distributed. If a child died, their share would go back to the estate and be managed by an executor, a cousin in Shropshire. Margaret felt understanding wash over her slowly. This was about money. A family that should have been mourning their youngest child was instead driven by greed. Back then, 150 would have been a lot of money. For a working-class family struggling in the slums of Whitechapel, it would have been life-changing enough to escape poverty, perhaps forever. But Margaret still couldn't understand the cold calculation behind it all. Time would have been their enemy in more ways than one. In the March cold, with no refrigeration, decomposition would begin within hours. The photographer would have had to work quickly, racing against the inevitable changes that death brings to a small body. Mary had died on March 4th, but the inheritance was supposed to be released on March 6th. The photograph had been taken on March 5th, almost certainly to serve as proof that Mary was still alive the day before the money was legally divided. There would have been no time for paperwork, no legal fight, no doctors, no long investigation. The Whitmans needed only one thing to avoid suspicion and secure the full inheritance: a single dated image of all 5 children together, a piece of visual proof to suggest Mary had still been alive when the money was legally split. This would explain why Dr. Acton delayed filing the death certificate, why Baden was called in secretly, why the session was held after dark and not in a professional studio but in the family's own backyard. It was a planned act. The fact that a family could be so calculating while their children were probably confused and heartbroken sent chills down Margaret's spine. Dr. Galton noted the language in the inheritance documents. The clause doesn't require medical certification. He explained, only satisfactory proof of each beneficiary's survival on or around the release date. Without official death records, which wouldn't appear for several days, a posed photograph could serve as believable evidence, especially if no one asked questions. And back then, no one was going to examine a photo of 5 children as closely as Margaret was examining now. People might not have asked questions back then, but she had questions now. Margaret returned to the photograph once more. With the new information in mind, she looked again at each child's posture. She noticed something she hadn't seen before: the expressions. Mary's siblings weren't grieving. They were tense. William, the oldest, stood with his mouth pressed into a tight line, staring not at the camera but just beside it. Elizabeth, turned slightly away, had her hands clasped so tightly they left faint marks in her gloves. The younger boys, Frederick and Charles, avoided her completely, their bodies angled away, their feet pointing in opposite directions. This wasn't a moment of mourning. It was something the children had been told to do, probably against their understanding or wishes. Stand still. Don't talk. Keep your distance. They hadn't disobeyed Thomas and Catherine at all. They had done exactly what they'd been told. Don't ask questions and don't talk about Mary to anyone. When Dr. Conquino, Galton's team, digitally enhanced the image one final time, one last detail came into focus, almost too faint to notice at first. At the bottom of Mary's left sleeve, near her wrist, there was a small pale tag sewn into the fabric. Zoomed in, it showed a series of hand-stitched initials, A.F., not Mary Whitman. Mary's full name was Mary Jane Whitman. Margaret's voice caught in her throat. "Foster," she said. There was only one other person in this whole mystery whose last name started with F, Annie Foster. Margaret tested the name, but she didn't want to believe it. She and Galton rushed back to the Acton collection files. A few pages earlier in the doctor's old records, they found it. An entry from February 1901. Annie Foster, 4 years old. Chest congestion, losing weight, treatment given. Poor outlook. Mother: Sarah, unmarried, domestic worker. No further notes, no death recorded. Annie Foster had died, possibly in late February, and Dr. Acton had never filed her death certificate. There had been no funeral record, no baptism or burial in the parish records. It was as if she had disappeared. And now it seemed she had reappeared, dressed in borrowed clothes, posed with a different family. For a moment, Margaret said nothing. What this meant was chilling, not because it was evil, but because it was so very practical. Acton, married but not to anyone named Sarah, and apparently childless, had quietly buried his illegitimate daughter, probably without his wife ever knowing about the affair. He had also, by chance or design, become the trusted family doctor of the Whitmans. When their youngest daughter, Mary Whitman, died days before an inheritance release, the opportunity was there. No one outside the family knew either girl well. The names were even similar. The child in the photograph might not be Mary Whitman at all. She might be Annie Foster, posed to pretend to be the Whitman's daughter just long enough to capture an image. The family's real daughter was already dead. Annie Foster, already deceased, had her body used for a single photo that would serve a single legal purpose. This would explain the borrowed dress, the wrong initials, and why no one in the image is physically touching the girl. Dr. Acton had taken his only chance to have a photograph of his daughter, overcome by his own emotions. In a world where infant mortality claimed 1 in 5 children before their 5th birthday, where a photograph was often the only keepsake a parent could afford of their lost child, he had seized this morbid opportunity. He'd manipulated the Whitmans in their grief to go along with his plan, and he'd stay quiet about the inheritance if they stayed quiet about Mary. It was a devil's bargain, born of desperation and paternal love, twisted by circumstance. Margaret wrote in her report, "The photograph, long believed to be a conventional post-mortem family portrait, instead reveals a far more complex deception, one in which a grieving family may have substituted a body in order to secure an inheritance." When the story was published in the Journal of Victorian Material Culture, it caused a media storm. It offered a glimpse into the blurred lines of grief, desperation, and legal gray areas in a time when children died frequently, and photographic images had a kind of legal weight no longer imagined today. Margaret never gave interviews. She declined television requests, stayed off social media, and never claimed moral outrage. The question we must ask isn't who lied, it's who had no other choice. The photo would forever stand out as one of the most shocking death portraits she'd ever seen. It questioned the decisions people made when overwhelmed by grief, and when money could offer something life-changing. If someone you loved had done something like this, not out of evil but desperation, would you see it as fraud or something more human? Did you enjoy this story? Would you lie to save your family from poverty? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked the story, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Desperation makes people do things they never thought they could. Thanks so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.